Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom on location here in Los Angeles, California, where I'm actually recording your Flip on Thanksgiving, right? Recording it on Thanksgiving because you know what? I didn't feel like actually recording those first couple of days. I wanted to relax. Y'all should have too. I hope you enjoyed it, but let's go ahead and get back into it a little bit. I hope you're watching this after Thanksgiving. Go enjoy some turkey and stuff like that. We're not doing turkey today. We're actually doing pork, but still. But the big thing about it, though, getting into it, let's pick up right where we left off in class talking about the changes in European lifestyle from pre-1700 to about post-1700, right? So the biggest thing about this unit, this stuff, this content that we've been talking about, is we're talking about how dramatically European society is beginning to shift, right? We are talking about how from before 1700, from before like the Renaissance, or excuse me, from before the Enlightenment era, there was a very there was an interesting model to European society, right? It was mostly agricultural, it was mostly agrarian, and the thing about it is you're going to see a big shift now because like all of the effects of the Columbian Exchange, exploration, agricultural revolutions and stuff like that is beginning to take hold in European society, leading to an intrinsically different group of people in a very different culture. This right here is all about the AP curriculum. This is all about how they love to use their different devices, and it talks all about how they love to use their different themes, right? Speaking of AP curriculum, speaking of pacing, speaking of stuff like that, what you need to understand is that analyzing change and continuity over time is one of the biggest things the AP, a college board loves to ask on the AP exam, right? And speaking of change over time, let's really kind of branch off real fast. On Google Classroom, after you get done watching this flip, go ahead and check that bad boy out, and I want y'all to go ahead and go over there and look, and there's going to be a schedule posted, right? A schedule posted of exactly what to expect and when to expect it. I'm also going to work on it today, all right, while we're cooking and stuff like that, getting you a new study guide made for your upcoming test. But that schedule is going to tell you when your next test is going to be, what the format of that test is going to actually look like, and how we're going to attack this thing going forward, okay? So go to Gander, all right, and then go ahead and watch the slip, and then take the next few days to relax a little bit, and let's go ahead and attack it when we get back from break. But going into it, though, let's pick up right where we left off in class, right? Where we left off in class, we're talking about another change, right? Remember, this is supposed to be an easy unit because we're just saying a big change here, the view of children, a big change here, the access to food, a big change there, population growth, right? We talked about the population explosion in Europe during this time period as well. Something that we need to understand, though, is that every single time you're going through your notes, that's what you should be looking at, right? Next major change, because on your study guide, it's going to be big change. How did the change of children happen pre and post enlightenment? And then I'll have little multi questions underneath it, like how is infanticide and foundling hospitals related? How's wet nursing and nursing your own children related, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So make sure that you're actually taking your time to study a little bit with intent, right? Because this is going to be a big thing that the AP test loves to ask about. Now, the next change we're going to talk about is access to goods, right? Now, we're not talking so much anymore about access to crops and access to foods. We're talking about access to goods, things, items, things that you can go out and buy, right? So something that we need to understand is that the fact of the matter is that there is something taking hold in Europe, right? It's this proto-factory system. It's this industrious revolution, not this industrial revolution quite yet, right? We are seeing the seeds, though, of the Industrial Revolution being sown, and we're seeing groups of people being able to have access to goods. And the thing about it is, their putting out system in the cottage industry in the wake of the agricultural revolution, making it so people do not have to work all day long anymore, is creating more items and more things and more goods, right? Merchants are being able to bring raw materials to the putting out system, to the cottages of the countryside, and they're being able to produce more and larger groups of textiles and other kind of crafts and handmade goods and things like that. So what we're seeing happen because of all this, since things are beginning to turn out more goods, we're seeing also a new social class being able to pop up, right? So what we're seeing is the growth of this middle class. Those merchants, the ones that are bringing the items to the cottage industry, are making tons of money off this system and a lot of money off the stuff that's happening in the wake of the agricultural revolution. Now, the thing about it is the middle class that you know of in the modern era, which is the largest class in most societies, it has very, very much always been known as the middle class, right? However, in Europe, it has a fancy name, and they're known as the bourgeoisie, or the bourgeois when you actually refer to them in French, right? Now, the thing that we need to understand every single time we refer to anyone called the bourgeois, we are talking about merchants, bankers, business owners, and people that are making money off this early putting out system and this early proto-factory system, right? Now, these are your early business owners. These are the ones making money rising up from the lower class, because before all of this, before the rise in the middle class, you had your lower class, which is mostly your participants in actual rural agrarian crop growing and like agricultural systems and things like that. But post-agricultural revolution, we're seeing this middle begin to grow, right? You're seeing the cities having a group of people that are walking around and they have larger homes and they have more money, but they're not nobles and they're not upper class and they haven't been sanctioned by the royals as like people with title and land, right? So they're these new people, the middle class, the bourgeois, right? And they're making all that money off the putting out system in the cottage industry. Now, something that we need to understand though as well is that word bourgeois is actually French, right? And when we talk about the word bourgeois in the middle class, a lot of people tend to think that the only place that the bourgeois have ever existed, or the bourgeoisie, that the only place that they have ever existed was just in France, because it's a French word, and we'll talk about them heavily when we get to the French Revolution and their involvement in it. But the thing about it is it's not really limited just to France, and you can make the argument that it didn't even start in France. You can make the argument that it actually started in the Netherlands, right? This picture right here is of Dutch gentry members, right? The gentry is another word for middle class, right? In the Netherlands, there were actually these really, really large groups of families and stuff like that had invested in things like joint stock companies and stock markets in the East India Company. Remember that. We're going to be talking about them a lot when we get back from Thanksgiving break. The East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and the fact that it's a joint stock company. You've got all these different family members and stuff like that investing in it and making tons of money off the global markets. I'm going to say it again, the global markets that are beginning to grow and span the entire globe post-European exploration. So the funny thing about it is the bourgeois actually kind of started in the Netherlands first and foremost, and then this idea is going to begin to spread, and other like countries are going to emulate those Dutch gentry middle class people, and they're going to start their own East India companies. They're going to start investing in those different things, taking big risks and making big profits, right? So going into it though as well, it's not limited just to France. Every single area and every single like country is having a growing middle class because of the expansion of these globalized markets, right? Because a lot of these people, these middle class merchants and stuff like that, they're not only investing in the countryside and production of goods, they're also investing in the goods that are coming off of these boats, right? The ones that are coming from the colonies in like North America are shipping in raw materials that are now going to be processed into new goods, right? The like the areas of like India and the East Indies are shipping spices and luxury items and silks and goods like that from the East Indies or the East Indian markets, and literally they're investing in those and investing in the companies themselves, making large money, like lumps of money off that. Now, goods are now more available than they ever have been, both foreign and domestic, right? That's what I'm getting at. Domestic goods are coming from the cottage industry. Foreign goods are coming from the trade that's going on all over the world at the time. Now, going into it, though, it's going to lead to this thing known as the consumer revolution. Now, the consumer revolution is going to be gravitated to harder by the middle class than anyone before, but something we need to understand about the consumer revolution is it's not limited just to the middle class. Literally, the lower class got involved in this consumer revolution as well, because remember, putting out system, they're making a little bit of cheddar on the side as well. They're making a little bit of extra money on the side too, because they're actually using their free time to make the goods for these merchants, so they're seeing a cut of the profits, right? So now not only have the rich people always been rich, who have always had access to goods, but now there are more goods that are now being accessed by a middle class and a lower class who's got a little bit of money in their pocket, right? So this new class particularly drives forward the consumer revolution, but the lower ones were involved as well. We'll get into some of the products here and you can actually see it. This new class begins to imitate the wealthy, and they begin to define themselves by the things that they buy, right? And so you're seeing a growth in a consumer revolution, and it's exploding. Some of the big things that are actually going to blow up that really help to define the consumer revolution is privacy, home goods, clothes, and new rooms, right? Big thing that we need to understand about the growing consumer revolution is when we go to Amsterdam and stuff like that this summer, you'll see it better than you'll see it anywhere else, right? The growth of housing and the adding of floors onto already existing homes by middle-class members of the Dutch gentry is one of the best ways you can talk about the consumer revolution all day. We'll talk about the construction of these homes, why they're built on a lean and stuff like that next to these canals, but the beautiful homes that you see right here in front of you are products of the consumer revolution, right? Products of that consumer revolution because you could pay money to add floors to your homes and create more private spaces. Because in the Middle Ages period, before the changes of society, before 1700s, most families that weren't in the royal or the noble classes lived in homes where everyone shared one giant room or one set of giant rooms. Well, what we can see is actually in the consumer revolution, they're expanding these homes and adding more rooms onto them and actually creating new areas for them to relax or do certain things and things like that. So you're seeing that in the middle class as well. One of the most famous ones was known as the boudoir, right? The boudoir, spelled B-O foudoir, was a French concept where women could actually entertain their friends inside of it. It was an intimate setting where they could actually sip tea and get ready and do, like, try on outfits for one another and stuff like that, and relax, and women could entertain other women, right? The boudoir room was a famous room that actually was a big thing during that actual consumer revolution, adding this room and this furniture and these things to this house that already existed. Now, an interesting thing about it, though, as well, is what about poor people? They couldn't just pay to add a brand new room onto their house. There's no way they could do that. But what they could do is they could buy what's known as a room separator, right? Room separators became very popular at the time. You could actually see it sitting behind this woman and actually behind her piano right there. A room separator would literally create a little bit more of a private space, and they could actually delineate certain areas of the home for certain things. Now, an interesting thing about this as well is, go ahead and jot this down, is some spaces are going to be used for raising children, right? Relating back to that earlier thing we talked about early on, where there's this changing view of children during this time period, where people are beginning to look at children as a blessing rather than a burden. They're beginning to dedicate space to them, right? Creating an area with a room separator where a crib can be on the other side to create a nursery, creating areas that are more for a living space and a communal effort, and actually using the room separator to actually block the bed from the rest of the view of the room so you could entertain and have people over and things like that. Now, that's not subject for the really low. If you got the cottage industry and you're making stuff with your hands or whatever, you ain't got no room separator. You're all still living in the same room. But something that a poor person could buy is maybe some dishes, right? So you see what I'm talking about? The consumer revolution affected every single level of society. For example, really poor families, oh man, that burp was rough. Pre-consumer revolution actually would share one giant bowl. They would actually cook all of their meals and put the entire meal into one giant bowl. And the only thing everyone had was a utensil to eat with, right? And they would literally eat out of the same bowl. Well, with the consumer revolution actually giving us access to more goods, porcelain goods and things like that, poor people could actually be like, oh, well, everyone gets their own plate now, right? Everyone gets their own plate, everyone gets their own bowl, everyone gets their own item, because we're now churning out things more than we ever have. Same thing too as well. Poor people used to cook over open fireplaces, right? A very large pot that would sit inside of your fireplace, and you would swing it out, which would be very difficult to cook multiple things on, and also it's very dangerous, right? The thing about it, though, is stoves are going to be a big thing about the consumer revolution, and people might actually go out and buy those. Another big thing as well that's actually going to pop up during the consumer revolution is different fashions, right? For example, if you were a wealthy upper-class noble, you might wear things like this that are actually like hand filigreed velvet, different items and different fabrics coming in from different areas, silks and things like that coming from the eastern reaches. Well, what about if you're middle class? You're going to try to imitate it the best that you possibly can, right? They're actually going to create mimicry of those upper class outfits and use cheaper cottons and things like that are now coming from North America, and they're going to try and actually produce a look of their own. Now, Rose Breton is actually another famous one as well, who is actually the main stylist and stuff like that, and the main stylist and the main fashion advisor of Marie Antoinette during the actual growth of the consumer revolution. She's actually going to push the boundaries of style and fashion during this time period for big hair and large looks, and there was apparently, we'll talk about it a little bit later on, the court parties of Louis XIV would have women walking around that had boats in their hair, or birds in their hair, but Rose Breton set those standards. But why does Rose Breton help us understand the consumer revolution a little bit better? People knew about her. They were making pamphlets about her. They were talking about the fashions that were being brought in by Rose Breton, and maybe you couldn't afford a Rose Breton style fashion, but you could afford a cheaper replica of it, right? A cheaper cotton replica of something like that. And then also, last but not least, one of the big things that you could buy as well, yet again, are books. Books, and more books. Books are actually being produced at a rate that they had never been produced at in before. And they're also different kinds of books. They're not just religious texts and things like that. So what you're seeing as well as our next change is you're seeing a growth in reading and relaxation, right? You're actually seeing a change in how people spent their downtime. Literacy, which you need to understand, is blowing up. On the back end of the consumer revolution, literacy is skyrocketing. It is making leaps and bounds. It is doubling on doubling every single 10 years in European history during this time period, because you just have access to more written material. Elementary education is also growing as well. And as this concept begins to spread out of Scotland and other areas who are beginning early elementary education, like accessible points and elementary education systems, what you're seeing is children are also learning to read at a very high volumes. And because of that, they want stuff to read. So literacy is going up. As well as something you need to understand is that these schools were not the best on the planet. This is actually a teacher who was in charge charge of this like room of children. He's hitting this kid's hands with a wooden spoon because he messed up his writing. But the thing about it is, though, is they're still teaching him how to read, and that kid knows how to write, right? And you're not just reading religious texts anymore. You're not just reading copies of the Bible like you used to. You're reading things like chapbooks, novels, pamphlets, the encyclopedia, and newspapers are beginning to become a popular thing that is actually spreading like word very, very quickly. The very first newspaper to ever actually pop up was in Austria, and it was called the Wiener Zeitung, which actually means the Vienna newspaper, right? And so the thing about it is these chapbooks, which are really, really small, kind of pamphlet-style books, might contain stories, fiction, novels are becoming really, really big. Pamphlets are spreading a lot of different ideas and a lot of political ideas. Now, censorship and stuff like that is going to be a big thing as well that we need to understand, because remember, we talked about how the encyclopedia was banned by like the French government and then also by the Catholics as well. But the thing about it that you need to understand is, was it really effective? Censorship, did it exist? Very much so. Was it effective? Not really, right? Like, it was not very effective in stopping the spread of these books because literally you're just the volume is too great, right? And then that's kind of what we talked about with the Enlightenment. Like when we talked about the growth of Enlightenment style culture, we talked about how there was a spread of illegal and legal texts, right? It didn't matter what you were writing, people were now coming into contact with these new stories. And also novels will be like published during this time period that are going to be heavily, heavily famous. For example, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe becomes a very, very famous novel that spreads all over Europe, that anybody who was anybody had read this story. What the story is actually about, Robinson Crusoe was a man who got stranded on a foreign island where literally he's on this island and he uses his own subsistence and himself, not the intervention of God, to actually survive, right? And it's all with him, and it's his own personal story of him pulling up his entire like existence, being stranded on this island and living the best life he possibly can. He meets a native who he actually teaches about Christianity and things like that. But the interesting thing about it was he was utterly alone and trapped for an epic battle of survival. That idea really relates to the growth of that middle class, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that the middle class had, where they were actually like believing in these different ideas of the personal work ethic of the person. So Robinson Crusoe was kind of one of their heroes. Another famous one is by like Goethe, who is a very, very famous German author who wrote a play called Faust that we'll talk about a little bit more in class, where literally this guy actually makes a deal with the devil because he wants to be as smart and as brilliant and as like able to woo women as possible, right? And that right there is the devil who actually tempts him. His name is Mephistopheles. Now, going into it though as well, not only is reading becoming a leisure activity that you could participate in during the Consumer Revolution, you're also seeing new leisure activities, right? Taverns are beginning to pop up in all the villages outside of larger cities. The taverns, of course, being a place where you can go and you can drink and get like, saucy. But then there's another place that we've already talked about, coffee houses, which existed in cities, which were for political discourse and things like that. Theaters are coming up everywhere. Public fairs are becoming a really big thing that you can actually go to in many villages, and you can go and see performances, and you can go to the shops, and you can actually participate in like actually buying these goods in the consumer revolutions themselves. Now, other big ones as well is you saw the growth of spectator sports, right? Spectator sports became a very, very big thing during the post-1700s era, whereas they didn't really exist beforehand. Some of the biggest ones you actually could go and see are horse racing, of course, which is very, very common. Like very, very big thing. I know Maylie Reese, big fan of horses and stuff like that. Horse racing was a very, very common spectator sport during the 1700s. And another big one as well was known as blood sports, right? Now, blood sports sounds super intense, because it is. What blood sports were spectator sports that really, really drew in that kind of lower to lower middle class group of folks, right? The people like the bourgeois who are now growing and want to go and watch something, might go and see a horse race one day, but might go and bet on blood sports another, right? Blood sports include boxing. Boxing at the time also was done barehanded, no gloves whatsoever. Cockfighting was a big one as well, which is of course putting two roosters in a pen together and watching them fight one another. The three most intense ones were all things called baiting, right? Baiting was basically the activity of taking a dog and then putting a certain animal in the ring with the dog, and they would see how many of the dogs that the animal could kill, or how long it would take the animals to kill, or like the dogs to kill that animal, right? So bear baiting was a very, very famous one, where they would actually literally tie a bear to a post and release dogs on the bear, and people would take bets on how long it would take the dogs to kill the bear, or how many like dogs the bear might kill, a lot of prop bets and stuff like that. Another famous one, of course, was bull baiting, was the exact same as bear baiting, and literally it was just they would tie a bull to a post and release dogs on it. Funny little thing about it is this special little English dog was actually bred specifically to actually fight bulls and stuff like that. That is the English bulldog. That's why they're referred to as bulldogs. It was for bull baiting competitions. The reason why they're actually bred in this way, if you look at this happy little chunk right there, their noses were set back a little bit, so whenever they would bite a bull, they could still like keep breathing without letting go, right? And that's why they were actually bred to be like stocky and strong, so they could actually participate in those bull baiting competitions. And if you've ever heard of another dog as well called a rat terrier, it was for actually these things called rat baiting, where they would release a bunch of rats into a pit and see how fast a dog could kill as many rats as possible, and people would take bets on it, right? So those are blood sports. Also, funny little thing about it is during the 1700s as well, we saw the earliest roots of football, right? We saw the earliest roots of like soccer becoming the very, very, very famous and popular pastime sport of Europeans during the 1700s, because as you can see, this is an actual advertisement in a British newspaper, a match of football between Ashton, Lever Townships, Middleton, Blakely, and Fretwich. It's like, and this was actually issued in February of 1778, right? So going into it, though, you're seeing the growth of those leisure activities. And last but not least, we have a change in art, right? So the big thing about it that we actually are seeing is the change in art is going to be very, very drastic in the 1700s, and we're going from that Baroque art, right? So Baroque art was the earliest one that we talked about that came in post-Renaissance, where it was pushed forward by absolutists and by the church, and to try and show grandeur in their financial investment in these different items, right? For example, this right here is Caravaggio, The Temptation of St. Matthew, right? This one right here is actually designed by Bernini. That is the Vatican, like Cathedral of St. Peter, right? And you can see grandeur, over the top, super intensity. This is by Bernini as well. This is actually a sculpture of Louis XIV, showing his magnanimousness and his intensity and his really, really over the top looks. And also we know as well the best Baroque architecture is none other than the Palace of Versailles. So the thing about Baroque architecture, though, is you're going to see it starting to slowly change, though, because it began to actually tone itself down a little bit. What you're seeing is that early on, people like Rembrandt start coming along and they start showing some slow change. Rembrandt was a very, very famous Dutch artist who was a member of one of those middle-class families who begins to actually kind of tone down a lot of the Baroque art, right? And it's going to slowly move into our next phase, right? So the thing about it is, like, this right here is on the Sea of Galilee. This is actually by, like, Rembrandt himself. And the big thing about, like, this, like, design by Rembrandt that you need to understand is, look at it. It's toned down. Wow, okay, I just turned the TV on. This one, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, as you can tell, is still intense. It's very, very like high intensity, but it's actually not using as many like giant themes. And this one, of course, is his most famous one. It's known as the Night's Watch, which actually shows a nighttime militia that is in charge of actually preventing crime in one of the Dutch cities. And it is actually Baroque art, but it's being toned down. And since it's being toned down, it then eventually moves into Rococo. Rococo being that cute pastel, warm pastel, sentimental stuff. Still an upper class movement. It was actually pushed forward by one of the mistresses of Louis XV, the king that followed Louis XIV, his grandson. And this right here, of course, Fragonard's The Swing is very, very famous, but she actually, one of like his actual mistresses, pushed forward the like warm pastels, the sentimentals, the fat chubby angels, the little cute like stories of love and sentiment. And then later on, you're going to see the growth of this other one called neoclassical art. And neoclassical art is going to actually continue the progression of toning down, right? Because we have the intensity of Baroque toned down into Rococo, and then it's going to be toned down into neoclassical, because this is when the middle class begins investing heavily in art as well. And neoclassical art is much more simple, it's much more symmetrical, it's a lot more Greco-Roman. For example, this one right here is the Pantheon in Paris, which very, very many famous French heroes were actually like buried, and we'll actually be going to it this summer. The Pantheon, though, actually like is completely symmetrical, and it uses Greco-Roman columns, right? This right here is Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon crossing the Alps, one of my favorite pieces and stuff like that. And as you can see, it is much more symmetrical. It focuses itself on an equestrian image of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat is a much more simple scene of including one person and their tragic death, right? This is neoclassicism, right? Or neoclassical art, and how it's actually beginning to make its transition of that toning down, that simple, that symmetrical, that a little bit more clean, right? So that right there is your like Thanksgiving flip. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.